docuseries director Jason Hehir joins me now. Thank you so much for being with us, Jason.
Thanks for having me. Good to be here.
So this is certainly a topic that folks who are from the city of Boston, in and around, and the state of Massachusetts are familiar with. As you started to compile the information, what was sort of the through line from all of the information, the interviews, and the data you collected?
Well, one through line is that people hadn't really talked about this in close to 34 years. There was a lot of reluctance for people to sit down in the first place. You had the media, institutions like the media and Boston City Hall and the Boston Police who didn't come out looking great in this. And then you had the family of the victim, obviously very painful there, and also the family of the assailant. That was also very painful for them to talk about. And then you have the family of the falsely accused assailant. And that's something that they haven't really trusted media with at all over the last few decades to talk about. So the through line, I think, was that this was very painful for a lot of people on a lot of different levels for a lot of different reasons. And there was a lot of reluctance to discuss that pain.
And it happens at a time where Boston is very racially divided. You had the busing and the riots after that and things like that before and after this murder. Did you find that there were parallels to, say, modern day cases? I'm thinking post George Floyd.
It's certainly the timing was right, I think, to tell the story. I've wanted to tell the story for many, many years. I remember vividly when I was 13 years old when all of this happened. Consuming all of the news, both on TV and in the local newspapers, the Globe and the Herald particularly. But the events that have unfortunately occurred in the last few years and the light that has been shown on the treatment of the Black community by a lot of police forces around the country made this feel like exactly the right time to tell the story. Did
you find that old resentments, old tensions remained as you interviewed folks for this piece, thinking back on 1989 and the events afterward?
Not just 89, but I think that there are certain communities in Boston who have had contentious relationships with the police and with Boston as a whole for generations. So that's why we chose to digress a little bit in episode 1 and give viewers a bit of context, starting with the beginning of what Howard Bryant, who we interviewed, called the modern history of race relations in Boston, which was 1974, the Garrity decision to force to integrate Boston schools, which we now know as the Boston busing crisis. So there were scars that lingered from that still hadn't healed, and those hadn't healed at the time that the Stewart case unfolded. And you could argue that that Stewart case, those 10 weeks when they were hunting for the so-called killer of Charles Stuart and her baby Christopher, you could argue that that was even a more painful time for the Black community in Boston. So yes, that pain remains.
Yeah, in fact, we have a clip from the docuseries highlighting Boston's race issues at the time and describing the aggressive manners of police officers toward Black men after the murder. So let's take a listen. You know, one of the things that we mentioned was that the Stewart and the Bennett families continue to be affected by this case and the aftermath. Did you find that the grief was the same in that, I guess I would say, is the way they experience the same, or are there similarities, or was it different?
Well, we didn't get participation from the Stewart family. We approached them many times and they declined to participate, and I understand why they wouldn't want to. We did get participation from the Bennett family, and I credit them with being brave enough to sit in front of cameras and tell their story after all these years. And I credit them with trusting me with these feelings that are deeply painful for them to discuss to this day.
Yeah. And so the Stewart family did not even have a conversation with your team?
We reached out to them in just about every manner that I saw possible, including, snail mail, email, phone, voicemail, social media, Facebook messages, friends and extended family around the Revere and Boston area who might be able to compel them to participate, but they chose not to, and I completely respect that. This story, it's important to note, is not about Charles Stuart.
Right.
I wasn't as interested in his perspective and why he killed Carol, why he committed this monstrous act. I was more concerned with telling the story of a community and the family that hasn't been able to properly express their pain for 34 years.
I'm also thinking about how different the Boston Police Department is from 1989 to now. In that time, we had our first black police commissioner, first black, higher-ups and things like that. So I'm thoughtful of in comparing. Do you think that this case changed things within the Boston Police Department, or at least the aftermath of it?
Well, if we had done an 8 or a 10 or a 12-part series, we would have certainly examined in the direct aftermath of this case the changes that the Boston police took, or the extent to which they changed, I should say, in hiring a new police commissioner and installing community policing, and the effect that that had on quelling the homicide rate in the city. So there were short-term effects that were a silver lining from this case. Unfortunately, we didn't get to go into that because our story was just about the Stewart case and examining the fraught racial history of Boston through the lens of that case. But certainly, there were leaders, there were current leaders in Boston and in all institutions who grew up in Boston at the time and remember that case vividly and cite it as one of the reasons why they went into politics or why they went into city governance was they were inspired by what they saw and what, frankly, they didn't see as this case unfolded.
Do you think someone who lived in Boston or continues to live in Boston during that time will find a new perspective on the events in watching this docuseries?
I hope so. I hope, all of us who come from Boston, I don't still live there, but I still frequently go back there, and a lot of my family is there. And it was a painful time to look back on for all of us, an embarrassing time, because most of Boston bought into this lie, hook, line, and sinker. And that's one of the reasons why I was interested in telling this story, was examining why we believed it, what this media landscape and what the cultural landscape was that made us believe this story so readily, without considering maybe the husband had something to do with it. Maybe it's not the black man who did this, as he says. So I do think that, that there are a lot of similarities that we can see now in the city, but I also think that we have made a lot of progress. And as Reverend Jeffrey Brown says in our final episode, there's a long way to go. But the Boston of today bears no resemblance to the Boston of 34 years ago.
Jason Hehir, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you for having me.
And now I want to switch gears to the lasting impact that the murder and subsequent manhunt has had on the black community and Boston at large. My next guest has followed that investigation and its impact from the beginning, and he recounts the story, sharing what police and the media got wrong and if anything has changed in the city since, in the Globe's accompanying podcast, Murder in Boston, the untold story of the Charles and Carol Stuart shooting. The Boston Globe columnist and associate editor, Adrian Walker, joins me now. Adrian, thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you for having me.
So this is a case that has, I assume, in what I've read and researched in some of this HBO documentary, has really cast a shadow on the city of Boston. People still feel its impact.
Oh, I think people do. Absolutely. Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a very unique story. Somewhere in the podcast, I call it the quintessential Boston story, because of the way it raises issues of race and class and murder and everything else.
And it's also at the backdrop of a very tumultuous time in the city of Boston, post-busing, post a number of other incidents. Is that correct?
That's right. Well, it was its own tumultuous time.
That's right.
Yes.
So talk to me a little bit about, what was the backdrop in the city as this murder had happened? What did the city look like? What was the landscape? What did those racial tensions look like?
It was a city that was beginning to emerge from the racial violence, the 15 years of racial violence prompted by school busing. But it was also a time of rising crime. Murder was exploding. Crack was here. So there was a lot of tension and anxiety around crime. And
when we're talking about this manhunt that we know now was from a false claim, it really stirred up those tensions again, or even heightened them in the city of Boston.
Absolutely. At the core of the story, part of the anxiety of this is, you have this white couple from the suburbs who have supposedly been set upon in this black and brown city, and, And you have all the tensions and anxieties that go with that, and the racism that goes with that.
That's right. And what did the tensions between the police and the community of color, the black community, look like then?
They were quite intense. This was an era of stop and frisk when police were stopping young black men on the streets with what they claimed was probable cause, maybe not, and searching them. So there was already a lot of tension. There were already court cases about this. The police had been ordered to stop. They basically refused to stop, despite the court order. So there was a lot of tension already, and then this just ignited it that much more.
Talk to me about news coverage at this time. How was it covered, and then how did that sort of impact the way people perceive that case?
The way what was covered?
The way the story was covered, the murder, the quote-unquote man.
Well, you know, right from the beginning, it was like this huge explosion. It was like, you know, people who walked into the newsroom the next morning talk about how it wasn't like another day, you know. Even though this was at a time when murder was exploding. I mean, I hate to say it, but people were getting shot. But this was different because the couple was white, because it happened in Mission Hill, because she was pregnant. It was just immediately this thing that we did not see typically covering homicides.
And we mentioned in the intro, there were things that the media got wrong, or at least in practice.
There were things everybody got wrong, because there was a suspect who was named, who was never charged. There was a second suspect, Willie Bennett, who was named and never charged. You know, the official story all fell apart January 4th, 1990, the morning Chuck Stewart jumps off the Tobin Bridge. What
was the feeling of that day when that happened?
The first feeling was, oh, my God, you know, because everybody realized all at once in one moment that everything had been wrong for 2.5 months, you know. And there was a feeling of being duped. There was a feeling of great anger. There was, on the part of officials, a lot of embarrassment. There were a lot of emotions, none of them good.
Well, speaking of emotions running high, you know, we know the impact continues to be felt. Nancy Gertner, who was the attorney for Matthew Stewart, on BPR yesterday, when asked by Andrea Cabral about the Globe report that alleges that Stewart had more to do with the crime than originally thought, this is what she had to say.
The Globe has gotten it completely wrong. It has taken on the role of a tabloid, really mischaracterizing grand jury testimony. And I'll give you a couple of examples. So one witness they described saw a man get out of the back seat of the car and stand by the car. Witness never said that. Another one says, I saw, you know, I was drawn to a man in the back seat. That's what I saw when the car was driving past me. The witness never said that. I can go on and on and on. The Globe has completely distorted and mischaracterized grand jury testimony that I have and that I know.
So
what she says is completely preposterous, okay? I've known Nancy Gertner forever, and I have a lot of respect for her. But A, she mischaracterized what is in the stories. If you go read the stories, they do not say what she says they said. Second, a lot of these documents are online on Globe.com. You can go read the people's grand jury testimony for yourself, and what you will see when you do that is that they don't say what Nancy Gertner says they said. What the story actually says about Matthew Stewart is that there are continuing questions about his role in the case. There have always been questions about, could Chuck Stewart have done this on his own? Did he really shoot himself? Did he have help? We know that he sought help. We know that he asked at least 2 people to help him murder his wife. And the question is, what was Matthew Stewart's real role? And we've raised that question. And it's a completely fair question.
It seems interesting that this would be the response as 34 years later from what we're looking at right now.
Yeah, it is interesting, and I'll have to say that it's not a typical response. The response I've gotten for this series is just overwhelmingly positive. It isn't this at all.
Do you find that folks in the black community, now that we're talking about this again, now that people are re-examining this case in modern times with a modern lens, are reacting differently to it?
So many people that I called about this story said, I'm so glad somebody's looking at this. I've always wanted to talk about this. As Diane Wilkerson said to me when I called her, she said, you know, we just stopped talking about this. And we need to have this conversation. And my fondest hope for this project, actually, is that it will prompt the conversation about race and class and crime and everything else that we did not have in 1990.
I'm also thoughtful, and I asked, the docuseries director, Jason Hehir, this question as well, about taking this case, there was a pressure to solve it. There was a backdrop of racial tensions. It feels a lot like post-George Floyd. And you cannot help but compare the two. Did you feel that comparison as well as you continue to report on this and, you know, go into this podcast and this docuseries?
Oh, absolutely. And the questions raised about the media coverage in this case are the same that you'll see in other stories, right? These questions have never gone away. And
so what are the lessons learned in your mind from that case? And then, of course, now we know the subsequent cases as we try to look at policing in that lens there.
The big lesson for me, and I think for other journalists who covered it, was, you know, to be careful about believing official stories. You know, question them and question them and question them some more.
What do you hope people take away from the podcast, this work, and then, of course, the docuseries that the Globe has partnered with?
You know, I think what I hope people will take away is that this is a really vital piece of Boston history, and we need to think about what it still has to say to us.
Do you think it has changed the Boston Police Department going through everything with that case in 1989? Has that had an impact on policing in the city of Boston?
Absolutely, I think it had an impact on policing in the city. You know, ultimately the police commissioner, Mickey Roach, was pushed out of office. It took a couple of years, but it happened, and it was a result of this. Initially, it was terrible for police community relations, but I think it made the police realize that they had to build stronger connections. And I think they have put some effort into that.
Adrian Walker, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you so much for having me.
The first episode of Murder in Boston, Roots, Rampage, and Reckoning is available now on Max. And you can listen to the first 3 episodes of the Globe's accompanying podcast on all streaming platforms and at bostonglobe.com.